Well, hello. Thank you for joining us today for our panel on deep sea mining. We're bringing you three incredible speakers who will each cover different perspectives on the topic. Namely, what does the science tell us about impacts of mining the seabed? What the cultural considerations around deep sea mining are, and what are the national as well as international views and approaches to policy on the activity of deep sea mining. This panel today is being hosted by the Sierra Club National Marine Team. I'm Lele Joy Shikasado, your moderator today, and I am chair of the Sierra Club National Marine Team. Founded in 1892, the Sierra Club is the most enduring and one of the most influential grassroots environmental organizations in the United States, with over 3.3 million active members and supporters. The Marine Team is composed of marine scientists, ocean conservationists, and legal experts from across the coastal United States, working on issues such as coastal resilience, plastic pollution, sustainable fisheries, and marine mammal protections. Today, we are delighted to bring you this educational and informative panel on the important topic of deep sea mining. Deep sea mining is the process of extracting mineral deposits from the deep ocean, such as polymetallic nodules, from minerals such as manganese, nickel, cobalt, and copper that are used in batteries and other renewable technologies that we have today. Deep sea mining uses large-scale industrial processes with significant impact to ocean life and ecosystems, as well as affecting the interconnected ocean food webs, nutrient cycling, and carbon sequestration cycles. While commercial deep sea mining in international waters has not yet been done, it would be managed by the International Seabed Authority under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is tasked with developing a mining code based on the consideration of benefit for all humankind while balancing economic needs with environmental considerations. Deep sea mining has catapulted into the spotlight when in April of this year, US President Donald Trump issued an executive order titled Unleashing America's Offshore Critical Minerals and Resources that would expedite permitting for seabed mineral exploration and recovery through the Department of Commerce, including in international waters, bypassing international rules. Today, we will go into depth about what the various considerations around this activity are and what the implications could be. The structure of today's panel will begin with a short presentation from each of our speakers, followed by a Q&A session. You can submit questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A button found in the bottom toolbar of your Zoom screen. So let us begin. Our first speaker is Dr. Andrew Thaler. Dr. Andrew D. Thaler is a deep sea ecologist, conservation technologist, and ocean educator. His work revolves around how humans use technology to explore, exploit, protect, and plunder the most remote ecosystems on the planet. He is founder and CEO of Blackbeard Biologic, an environmental consulting firm that specializes in high seas policy, open source marine sensors, and ocean education. He has been engaged in understanding the environmental consequences of deep sea mining since 2008. Go ahead, Andrew.
All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for attending. So I got my start in the deep sea mining world as a graduate student, working on understanding the environmental impacts of a mining site called Solwara 1, which is a hydrothermal vent deposit off the coast of Papua New Guinea. And at the time, Solwara 1 was on track to be the first of the experimental deep sea mines to enter commercial production. And I am going to make a confession right now, which is going to very much annoy Arlo. But I entered that project. I wouldn't say I was a proponent of deep sea mining or an advocate of it, but I entered it as an optimist. I believed that Nautilus had a reasonable argument that they were making about how they could mine this particular seafloor massive sulfide deposit in a way that had the potential to be environmentally responsible. And because I thought their argument was reasonable, I thought we had a duty to go out as scientists, as ecologists, study those ecosystems, understand the baseline, give them a fair shake, and really see if those claims held water. So what I discovered in this environmental baseline assessment, I was looking primarily at biodiversity and connectivity, particularly genetic connectivity, was that while the claim being made was that hydrothermal vents, particularly these specific hydrothermal vents, are incredibly dynamic. Um, they are sitting on volcanic arcs, so they turn on and off all the time. The ecosystems have evolved to deal with a tremendous amount of resilience. What we actually discovered is that hydrothermal vent systems are very well connected to each other across large spatial scales, and that impacts to one affect the entire chain of hydrothermal vents, and that there really isn't any way to responsibly mine a hydrothermal vent in a form that could be respectful to the marine environment and could mitigate biodiversity. So I entered into the deep sea mining world as an optimist, and I came out particularly of looking at hydrothermal vent mining as uh, someone who believes that there is really no responsible way that you could mine a hydrothermal vent in any kind of environmentally responsible way. And I did that based on, going in with a good faith acceptance of Nautilus's argument and coming out with okay, we've now looked at the science, and we now know, having looked at the science, that this is not something we can do sustainably. So hydrothermal vent mining is only one kind of deep sea mining, and we often lump all these different kinds of deep sea mining into this one overarching term just because they all happen to happen in the deep sea. But the reality is you have seafloor massive sulfide mining, which is the mining of hydrothermal vents. You have cobalt-rich crust mining, which is the mining of crusts that form on seamounts. And you have polymetallic nodule mining, which is the mining that happens on these polymetallic nodule fields that are stretched across the abyssal plain. And these are very different kinds of mining practices. They are functionally three very different industries, that they all have their own kinds of environmental impacts. They all have their own benefits and detriments, and they really need to be approached as separate entities, which is a problem in the international policy regime and currently in the US policy regime, because right now the International Seabed Authority, who regulates deep sea mining in the high seas in areas beyond national jurisdiction, is treating all three forms of mining as one cohesive industry and is developing a mining code that will apply to all three, despite the fact that they are very different entities on their own and will have very different rules and very different impacts. So right now, the predominant form of deep sea mining that is being proposed is polymetallic nodule mining on the abyssal plain. And once again, we are in a position where it is an industry in its infancy. No one has commercially mined the abyssal plain anywhere in the world. There is technology under development right now. Some companies are more advanced than others. Some companies are just getting started. But we are only kind of beginning to understand the totality of what biodiversity in the deep sea, and particularly biodiversity on the abyssal plain, looks like. So when these mining companies go down, and currently the predominant form of polymetallic nodule mining is using these tracked crawlers that are sucking these nodules up from the seafloor and pumping them to the surface. The area that the tracked crawler drives over is directly and immediately impacted by the robot itself, as well as the suction effect of pulling up the nodules. And so the ecosystem immediately underneath the crawler, is systematically removed. It's total destruction in that immediate area. The crawler itself produces a plume as it crawls across the seafloor. That sediment plume then spreads across the seafloor and buries and smothers the surrounding sediment and potentially buries and smothers benthic organisms. There's also a plume produced in the midwater from the dewatering process while they're treating the nodules on the ship after it's get pumped up to the surface. That midwater plume can spread for hundreds to thousands of kilometers around the exhaust vent, and it impacts midwater species. It can impact commercially important fish species. It can impact any of the animals that participate in the diel vertical migration. It's also an incredibly noisy process. So any siniferous animals, so whales and dolphins, as well as some species of sharks and other fish that depend on sound to communicate and to navigate, are disrupted by the noise produced by this process. It also brings light. So the deep sea, one of the things that the deep sea is characterized by is a complete lack of light. The animals that survive down there are very rarely exposed to light. And when they do see light, it's in the form of bioluminescence, which is something that they use to communicate, which is something they use to find mates, which is something they use to attract prey or scare off predators. And so when you drop a robot on the seafloor with these massive halogen bulbs, you blind all the organisms in the area. And those organisms that are previously adapted to only deal with tiny amounts of light are now in a position where they're essentially incapable of using one of their primary forms of communication. So there are a lot of um, known and potential impacts from this industry. Um, and one of the really kind of unfortunate things that happens is that as scientists in particular, and I'm guilty of this, and a lot of other scientists are guilty of this, but especially among deep sea scientists, when we think about and talk about biodiversity in the deep sea, we keep getting hamstrung by something I've started referring to the deep deficit. And the deep deficit is it's not a lack of knowledge, but it's this centuries long pattern of ascribing limits to life in the ocean. So the azoic hypothesis came out in the 18th century that said no life could survive below 600 meters. And then we discovered life below 600 meters, and we've stretched those limits out. So it's this process. You ascribe limits to life in the ocean. You make new discoveries that challenge those limitations, and then you push that line down just a little bit further, so that we're constantly in this position where we're chasing the limits of life, rather than what we should be doing, which is we should be starting from this first principle that life in the deep sea is abundant, life in the deep sea is varied, and life in the deep sea is infinitely more creative than our own imaginations. So that when we do make these new discoveries, we aren't constantly caught off guard by finding things like hydrothermal vents, which fundamentally change our understanding of life on Earth, and then finding two or three more ecosystems that do the same thing over and over again. Um, and this has real policy impacts as well. When we start from this principle of a deficit, it becomes the responsibility of scientists to prove that there's something there that could be harmed. If we start from a principle of abundance instead, it is now the duty of those who seek to exploit the deep ocean who must prove that they can avoid unacceptable harms that we already know. And we talk a lot whenever we talk about deep sea biology, we say, oh, we know so little about the deep sea. How can we possibly begin starting these industries when there's so little known about the deep sea? We've only explored a percent of the deep ocean. We've only named possibly 5% of myofauna that we've seen in the ocean. But I actually think we do know enough about the deep sea to talk about the impacts of this emerging industry as a whole. So we know that nodule fields are more diverse than the rest of the abyssal plain, usually by 2 or 3 times, and that the abyssal plain itself is phenomenally biodiverse. We also know that because biomass is limited in the deep sea, so you have lots and lots of species, but very few individuals of that species, that biodiversity is fragile. It lacks resilience. And so we know that any large scale impact to the seafloor is going to result in significant biodiversity loss, and it's going to result in local extinction. But we also know that nodule fields are incredibly slow to form. They take millions of years to grow, so that recovery occurs over geologic timescales, which means that as far as humans are concerned, any loss that we experience in the deep sea is a permanent loss. And we know that those impacts will extend beyond the seafloor. They'll extend into the water column, where it becomes even harder to assess the totality of those harms. So, knowing that, I think it is contingent upon the mining companies to demonstrate how their specific approaches are going to address these known impacts and justify why those impacts are necessary, rather than for scientists to have to constantly be chasing this deep deficit and constantly redefining the limits of life in the deep ocean, when we know that the deep sea itself is not only one of the most biodiverse regions on the planet, but as something that covers more than half the surface area of the planet, it is very likely that the deep ocean is more biodiverse than the rest of the entire planet's ecosystems combined.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Um, Next, we have Solomon Pili Kahoʻohalahala. Uncle Sol is a seventh generation native Hawaiian descendant, kupaʻāina from the island of Lānaʻi. He is the current chair and native Hawaiian elder of the Papahānaumokuākea National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council and Native Hawaiian Cultural Working Group. He is also the current chair of the Hawaiian Islands Humpback Whale National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council and served as a cultural community member of the Pacific Islands Heritage Marine National Monument. He is an observer and active cultural voice at the International Seabed Authority, seeking inclusion of Native Hawaiian perspectives and mitigation efforts concerning deep sea mining issues and threats to our Hawaiian marine ecosystems.
Hi, aloha kako. Thank you very, very much, Lele. Um, I'm very happy and pleased to be part of this esteemed panel of presenters giving different perspectives, and I hope that I can share a cultural perspective. To begin with, I would like to open with a very uh, short oli, which is one that calls upon our kupuna or our ancestors to gather amongst us in this time of important discussions. And I would like to invite you to join me in this. So if I may, then I would like to begin with e homai. E ho mai ka ike mai luna mai e o nā mea huna no ia o nā hamele e ho mai e ho mai e ho mai e ho mai ka ike mai luna mai e o nā mea huna no ia o nā hamele e ho mai e ho mai e ho mai e ho mai ka ike mai luna mai e o nā mea huna no e o nā mele e ho mai e ho mai e ho mai Ai, mahalo. So the cultural perspective of deep sea mining. Maybe I can tell you a story of my journey that leads me to this important issue of deep sea mining. So we grow up in Hawaii taking care of our own home, our ocean, and our lands. And we have a term maukamakai, which means that the land is connected to the sea and it's never divided. So we have this interrelationship of all things. We're also taught that in our gathering for sustenance, that we only take what is needed and necessary for us to be sustained. And we're always mindful that in our gathering, that we envision that there is a future that is needing resources. So we're taking it responsibility with the future in mind. So with that as sort of a basic foundation, um, we move to protect our areas. So our local communities protect their seashores and their mountains. And then the protection moves beyond our own familial areas. And so the the large ocean protection, like Papahānaumokuākea, um, was an area that's far beyond what we can see from our own islands. But nonetheless, it's connected to the same archipelago, it's connected to the same ocean. And while we do not have an opportunity to see these spaces, we know that the stories shared and the experiences gained and the observations made talk about our relationship with these spaces. So when it came time to talk about the conservation of ocean, it became a responsibility, an inherent responsibility on us to seek the care and protection. When we moved to look at perhaps increasing the protection of the area of Papahānaumokuākea to its 200-mile limit, we had a lot of pushback from commercial fisheries, especially saying that you're protecting an area of nothingness, that there is nothing there except barrenness. But in the research that took place immediately after those initiatives, what we began to find from deep sea now dives in the area of Papahānaumokuākea, that they discovered a new mountain range of mountains underwater that had never been known before. They were discovering new species of plants, corals, fish that had never been recorded before. And what the science began to verify is that in this new discovery, that the deeper that they went into the sea, um, these species became endemic to place. And that the deepest areas below the newly found mountains were all endemic to that area. So for me, it spoke to the idea that life continues to be created in this space of the deep sea. In that process of discovery, what was also discovered was one of the largest coral heads found on Earth to date. And it is said by the scientists who aged that say that the coral, a living coral in Papahānaumoku, was deemed to be between 4,500 and 5,000 years old. And they said this coral began at the time of the pyramids being built in Egypt. And then they found some of the largest sponges ever recorded on the planet. That brings us back to the connection that we have to our genealogy. And the Kumulipo, which is our genealogy of creation, begins in the very first wa, the very first section, in the very first several lines. And it says, Hanau Kumulipo ikapo hekane, Hanau po ele ikapo hevahine. So here in the deepest and the darkest part of the ocean is the creation of Kumulipo and Poele, energy that attracts each other. And they say when the energy of Kumulipo and Po come together in the vali or in the organic matter in the deepest parts and the depths of the sea, is going to incite creation of life. And then it says, Hanau ka uku ko'ako'a he ko'ako'a puka. And it says that the first creature to come from the energy of Kumulipo and Po'ele would be the coral polyp. And so we look at the coral polyp as our eldest ancestor, and therefore all other things created in the genealogy now says in the vertical water column how all things are created, moving into the nearshore waters, into the land, into the hills, to the mountains, and even taking flight in the sky above. And all of this is done under the canopy and the movement of the sun and the moon and the constellations that are persistently reminding us of the seasonal changes. This is our creation. And then when it occurred to me that in conservation, that this issue of deep sea mining was going to now come into the area of the deepest part of the ocean and decide now to take what they are calling, what Andrew explained, is that polymetallic nodules, and they looked at that as a resource for the green economy. And I thought the irony of this kind of a movement for mining was contrary to our creation of life in the deep sea, but the process of mining was in fact going to be very detrimental and very destructive. And so when entering into this realm, I was invited to attend a meeting in Kingston, Jamaica, into the International Seabed Authority that is housed there as the entity that's responsible for the deep seabed floor and all of the rules and regulations and the policies and perhaps the licenses and the permits to allow for exploration and then eventually for exploitation of deep sea nodules was housed in Kingston, Jamaica. And at that point, I was introduced now to an international body that was about to make decisions on mining. And I intervened here nearly, 30 years after the creation of this body. And I began to talk to them about a, a part of our connection to the deep sea that is written in our genealogy. And I presented my genealogy to them and saying that I felt that the process of making rules and regulations at an international level was done in a manner that did not include the indigenous and the native Hawaiians and their perspective and their relationship to the ocean. It struck the body by surprise in that a lot of them were confused as to what I was saying. And so I said, your regulations talk about the preservation of cultural heritage as artifacts that are man-made, found under the water, shipwrecks, human remains, which we support. But it does not speak to the connection and the genealogy I have that says this is where life is created, and this is where our eldest creation, our eldest kupuna began life. So there has to be some way to integrate our cultural connection to the deep sea. And so it's been 4.5 years since I've been at the ISA trying to intervene with this kind of perspective and then modify or create new language so that our connection and our relationship to the deep sea is not left out of the policymaking. And so we are currently in the process actively talking about underwater cultural heritage and then trying to intervene and bring into the decision making the relationships that we have. So what I think that is important for us is to know that the area, especially that is being considered for deep sea mining, is adjacent to Hawaii, and it stretches from the 200-mile imaginary boundary around the Hawaiian Islands and stretches all the way across the East Pacific to Mexico. And the entire area of ocean that is the Clarion-Clipperton Ocean is already subdivided by nation states from all around the world that are members of the ISA, seeking to take their plot of ocean as potential areas for exploitation, where they would begin perhaps mining should the rules and regulations are allowed. And so it brings to me the fact that we cannot allow this to happen, especially in this thinking that it's done in an area that is not within the jurisdiction of Hawaii. So it's beyond the lines and the imaginary boundary. But as a cultural people, we do not separate land and sea. We do not separate the ocean by an imaginary line. And then yet we are talking about a process that is detrimental to the continuation of creation from our perspective. So somewhere between now and in the next decision making of the ISA body, which is probably in July of 2026, we want to be able to affect this body to make sure that our perspective as the indigenous and the native peoples of Hawaii are reflected in those policy decisions. And so this is the point at which we enter into this body 30 years after its creation. And I was told, too little, too late. And I said, I disagree with that, and I do not accept that perspective, because for me, 30 years ago, this body, the ISA, were dealing with a new treaty of the law of the high seas, and conditions were very different then. We are here 30 years later, and the conditions of the seas are different, and the perspectives of the indigenous people have never been given consideration. So it is perhaps the time in which change is needed, and that is why we're here. And we're going to pursue and continue this for the integration and the inclusion of the indigenous perspectives, because we are the ocean people. So thank you. I'll end there.
Mahalo nui, Uncle Saul. Thank you. Thank you so much for representing the Native Hawaiians and other indigenous peoples with the important things that you have to say. So next up, we have Arlo Hemphill. Arlo Hemphill is a wilderness advocate and is currently leading Greenpeace USA's Protect the Oceans campaign to stop deep sea mining. His educational background is in marine biology, and he is a fellow national of the Explorers Club and has been listed in Nature as one of 100 plus global biodiversity experts. He is a founding steering committee member of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition and is best known for his involvement in regional scale ocean conservation. Take it away, Arlo.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I really appreciate the company that I'm in. These are all great people on this panel. I'm here to talk about a topic that's a little bit more drier than the other two speakers, the politics. So I am going to share a slideshow so that at least you have something fun to look at while I speak. Okay, just as I get started, just to explain a little bit more about where I come from and what I represent. The Stop Deep Sea Mining campaign is a global Greenpeace campaign that is implemented across our 40 different country offices around the world. And our goal is to ensure that commercial deep sea mining never launches as an industry in the world ocean. Our primary strategy is to build political momentum for a global moratorium against deep sea mining, with a secondary strategy to combat false narratives that are coming from the deep sea mining industry so that we retain the court of public opinion against this industry. And then specific to my office, I lead the campaign for the US office. Our role is to support the global strategy, prevent deep sea mining from launching in US waters, challenge US-based companies seeking to mine in US waters or internationally, and we ally and support Pacific leaders that live under US jurisdiction or occupation, like my good friend Uncle Saul here. What I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes is what the world looked like before Trump, how the global community was addressing deep sea mining, the US before Trump, how the US was specifically treating this issue, and now the US and deep sea mining under Trump and what's happening there. And I'll wrap up with exposing you to a few of the companies that are looking to threaten the deep through the US legislation. Going back to 1974, billionaire inventor and aviator Howard Hughes launched this big campaign. He had this big ship. It made global media coverage that he had this new ship and he was going to go out into the middle of the ocean and mine the deep and seek riches for himself and the US. And it all turned out to be this big conspiracy. There was no real mining interest. It was a CIA operation that used the ship to go to retrieve a Russian nuclear sub. And it all just kind of fizzled out into this big mess of conspiracy and politics. But what happened is it launched real interest in deep sea mining. That countries started thinking, hey, well, we might be able to actually do this. And at the time, little was known about the deep sea, as Andrew talked about, the deep deficit. And also the world was engaged in a Cold War. And what started to materialize was a very real risk of a militarized resource rush of the rich countries going out and taking what they can while they can. And so the world needed an off-ramp from this situation. And what it got, this wasn't only because of deep sea mining. There was a number of other ocean governance issues that led to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But basically, the law of the sea is what materialized as that off-ramp, the thing that could stop this free-for-all in the world ocean and find a way to regulate deep sea mining if it were going to happen at all. It was signed in 1992, entered into force in 1994, but the US insisted on a new implementing agreement because they were not happy with the original version. The rest of the world went along with that. The US signed it, but then did not ratify it. And so, but part of that new implementing agreement provided for a regime relating to minerals on the international seabed. And it evoked something called the common heritage of humankind. And this is the principle that the deep seabed belongs to every human being on Earth. And if that we are to exploit it, it should benefit every single person on Earth and only ever be used for peaceful purposes. And this was what was seen as the off-ramp to de-escalate the global powers from a resource rush and make sure that the rest of the world, especially the developing world, was going to benefit from this if it were to happen. It also established the International Seabed Authority that Uncle Saul was talking about participating in. So this International Seabed Authority is based in Kingston, Jamaica. It acts like the UN. It looks like a UN assembly room. The rules of negotiation are very similar to other UN bodies and to the UN itself. And their main task ever since 1994 has been to negotiate a mining code, which would be the full body of regulations that would regulate any future deep sea mining industry. And it needs to include a benefit sharing regime and something called the enterprise, which is this really strange concept that the ISA itself would kind of create their own company that would go out and mine and then distribute the profits to the developing world. And the USA is an observer in this, but it is not a member because they have not ratified. Since its founding, the ISA has issued 31 exploration contracts to 22 different contractors. And I'll clarify that all of these contractors are countries at root. A country can choose to hire or form a partnership with a corporation, and then that corporation takes the role of the contractor, but only a country can actually apply for these contracts. And I would like to also say that, just point out that although there's been no commercial mining in international waters, actual test mining that has retrieved hundreds of millions of pounds of nodules has occurred under some of these exploration contracts. As both of the speakers so far have pointed to, the sort of the epicenter of interest right now is in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. You can see Hawaii up in the top left corner, and you can see Baja California, Mexico up in the right. This area is as long as the continental United States, and as you can see, it's chopped up into blocks of interest of different countries basically claiming their bit of the ocean that they want to exploit in the future. So for many years, the countries were kind of slowly negotiating this process. It was not really very visible to the public. The environmental community was not very interested in this because it was a very slow process. It turns out when you agree that you're going to share all your benefits with everyone in the world, it takes a lot longer to reach an agreement. But then in 2021, Nauru entered an intent at the ISA that they wanted to begin deep sea mining. And the rules of the law of the sea say that if any country comes to the floor of the ISA and declares an intent to start mining, that within 2 years of that date, they need to be allowed to move forward, and that the mining code must finish. This was largely seen as a move by the metals company, which is the contractor that is allied with the country of Nauru. The metals company, from all outside perspectives, this is a perspective, was tired of waiting for the governmental process and pushed Nauru to kind of trigger this thing. And it basically set off geopolitical chaos because countries were not ready for this. They didn't feel that they were at the point where they could finish the mining code. And they also didn't like being pushed around by a single corporation telling them what to do. And so it really led to a lot of geopolitical pushback and chaos. And now it's been more than 2 years since 2021. And so the governments of the world are now basically in breach of their own contract because they haven't allowed the mining to begin. And so really the best way to resolve this problem at the moment is to agree to a moratorium that would basically call a timeout on this until further down the road when the science is there and governments are really ready to do it and not being pushed by a single actor. To this date, 40 countries support this moratorium. These are those countries, and more keep raising their hand pretty much every month. And so now let's look at what the US was up to prior to the administration. Despite not being a member of the UN Law of the Sea, the US benefits disproportionately from it more than almost any other country. One of the provisions of the Law of the Sea allows countries to declare a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. Because of the vast Pacific territories that are owned by the US and France, those two countries have the largest two exclusive economic zones in the world. They have more ocean than any other countries. It provides for the freedom of navigation for the US military and US cargo ships and everything else, that they're free to prowl the world's oceans without interference. And it also allowed the US just a few years back to claim a 1 million square mile chunk of the Arctic Ocean as an extended continental shelf claim, meaning that all of the economic benefits of the seabed of this bit of the Arctic belong to the US, and it's the law of the sea that allows them to do that. The US recognizes most of the law of the sea as customary international law, meaning they obey it, they go along with it. However, the Trump administration claims that this does not include deep sea mining. So they agree to everything in the law of the sea, except for deep sea mining. They say they can basically do whatever they want because they didn't ratify the law. Meanwhile, 4 US states, the entire west coast of mainland US, Hawaii, and American Samoa, have passed legislation banning deep sea mining. Prior to the Trump administration, the US federal policy was grounded in science and environmental protection. Their participation at the International Seabed Authority was advocating for the strongest possible environmental regulations based on the strongest available science. And that was also their approach in national waters. There was existing programs mapping and studying the geological resources of the deep sea, but they were doing it as a scientific program. They weren't looking at exploiting it at the time. It was more of they were mapping out what was there and what the U.S. had access to, but they weren't looking to exploit it. The U.S. has always participated in good faith as an observer as the U.S. And as I said, they had originally signed that 1994 agreement, making them at first a provisional party, but then when the country never ratified, they were reduced to an observer. Then April 24th, 2025, while coincidentally the UN was meeting and passing a new high seas biodiversity treaty, Trump signed an executive order kicking off processes for U.S. licensing of deep sea mining, both in U.S. waters and in international waters. The U.S. part of that, president has for better or for worse, the president of the United States has the right to make an executive order like that. The international component is broadly condemned by many nations around the world, and the ISA itself, it's seen as is in conflict to the UN law of the sea. Many people will say illegal, and it depends on what expert you talk to, whether it's just in contradiction or whether it's absolutely illegal under international law. But either way, the policy is undermining the UN law of the sea. What it could potentially do is if the US just goes out and says they're not beholden to international law, we can do whatever they want. That might encourage other countries to say, well, if the US is doing it, we're going to do it too. And that starts undermining the whole principle of the law of the sea and leading us back to that resource rush of global powers that the law of the sea in part was meant to prevent in the first place. So how did we get here? Why did Trump do this? How did we get to this place? Basically, what it boils down to is the deep sea mining corporates anticipated Trump. For the decade before Trump, their main public narrative was around the green transition, that we needed to mine the deep sea in order to prevent climate change, to move to green technologies. They completely gave that up with the incoming of the Trump administration and shifted to a narrative of national security and defense. They spent millions of dollars lobbying defense hawks, and they exploited the China threat on Capitol Hill, the idea that China is after all the world's resources and the US is falling behind, and we have to deep sea mine if we're going to keep up with China. At the same time, now that Trump has placed this executive order, they're backpedaling out of the ISA. The metals company, the same company that triggered the 2-year rule alongside Nauru, has basically said they're going to stop being involved in pursuing licenses with the ISA. They're going to work with Trump now. And Greenpeace USA has published a whole report on this. Here's the URL if you want to dive in to this whole narrative shift of the industry to basically get Trump to do what he did. So deep sea mining in U.S. waters. To date, the U.S. government has expressed interest in opening deep sea mining leasing off of American Samoa and in the Northern Mariana Islands. This picture over here on the right is the proposed lease area off of American Samoa, and the red square below it is Rose Atoll National Marine Monument, one of the most pristine Pacific atolls in the world. Just a complete national treasure of the entire world. This place is just a wonderful marine environment, and we're now proposing deep sea mining immediately adjacent to it. BOEM, which is the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, which is under the Department of Interior. For those who are not familiar, it's the same agency that regulates offshore oil drilling. Should we start deep sea mining, they will be that agency for deep sea mining as well. They issued a public comment period over this past summer, asking for public input. Should we start deep sea mining in American Samoa? The answer from the majority of respondents was overwhelmingly opposed. Yet BOEM, for all intents and purposes, appears to be moving forward despite opposition of both the American Samoa government as well as the public input that they received from that public comment period. Now, on the international side of it, the is not managed by BOEM. It's managed by NOAA under a law from the early 1980s called the Deep Seabed Hard Mineral Resource Act. This is an outdated law in that it was meant to be a stopgap while the countries of the world were negotiating the law of the sea. And essentially what it did is it built a framework for how US companies could apply for a US license under the ISA structure. It was never intended to be the US acting as its own regulator for licenses in international waters. But the Trump administration is using this outdated law that was intended for a different purpose to basically become the world's regulator themselves instead of it going through the International Seabed Authority. We know that two companies are currently applying, and at least one of the applications, the one company has 3 applications in. At least one of those applications is in this certification determination stage. I'm not going to read this whole chart. I'll let you see the process. You can read the chart yourself, but the certification determination stage is basically halfway through the process, and that's where we already are with one of these license applications. And I'll also add that NOAA, via the Trump administration, is seeking to further condense this timeline. They want to take the process for getting an exploration license and the process for getting an exploitation license and merge it into one, so that you don't need any public comment or environmental impact assessments in between them, that you can go right from your exploration to exploitation. This is against even the law that they're using. And yet that's where we are. And all of this, I'll say, all of this will end up in court. There will be challenges to all these advances and decisions being made by the Trump administration. And that wraps up the overall policy of where we are right now. And I'll show you a couple of the players, just because I think the public should start being aware of who these companies are, because they're going to, if they succeed, they're going to be affecting a huge swath of the global ocean. The biggest, most vocal company, and also the most ready company, is called the Metals Company. They were the ones who got Nauru to trigger the 2-year rule, and they are the ones who are now have 3 different applications for licenses in international waters, and are saying goodbye, International Seabed Authority. Trump's got our back. They're close with the Trump administration. They're a Canadian-based company, but they've created a U.S. subsidiary, as is the law under the executive order that it has to be a U.S. company that applies for these licenses. Then you have Impossible Metals. They are probably the number 2 in terms of public profile. That's largely because their CEO, pictured here, is a prominent voice. He has his own podcast. He regularly speaks at international conferences. He's speaking at one today in Florida. And he's becoming a major voice and advocate for deep sea mining. Their main interest in the U.S. is to mine in American Samoa, in that area that I showed you a couple slides ago. But however, the company has other international interest, including mining in international waters in partnership with Bahrain. And they are a U.S. company with a Canadian subsidiary. And then there's Ocean Minerals LLC. They have a kind of a different approach. They have a subsidiary in the Cook Islands. They are looking to mine in the waters of the Cook Islands. They basically convinced the U.S. government to form a new partnership, U.S. Cook Islands, to advance deep sea mining in the Cook Islands. But they've also recently testified at Congress and expressed interest in mining in U.S. waters. So who knows, what they're going to propose next. And I'll wrap it up there.
Well, thank you so much, Arlo, and thank you to all of our speakers. And as you heard here, you can see that there are multiple considerations around this potentially highly destructive and likely irreversible activity. One takeaway that Uncle Saul and others raised is that we mustn't conflate current renewable technology with sustainability if their components are sourced from seabed minerals. And to know that our climate security, as well as our seafood industry and deep culture, could be threatened by deep sea mining does not appear to be a good compromise for this short-term gain. Kind of supplement what these speakers have talked about, I just wanted to point out that new battery technologies are already moving away from the specific minerals that are being mined from these nodules. and this will result in a reduced demand for them as they adopt these newer technologies. In addition to that, many of the world's largest companies have already pledged to keep deep sea minerals out of their products. This includes Google, Apple, Samsung, Volkswagen, BMW, and 69 other large corporations, companies, and firms. And another huge factor in this is that we currently lack the processing capability for these deep sea deposits on land. We don't have the industrial facilities to process any of these materials that are mined, which obviously serves as a major hurdle for their utility. So thank you again to all of our speakers. We can move on to our questions. The first question was that somebody from Hawaii stated that they're very proud that in July of 2024, a bill passed in the Hawaii State Legislature, becoming Act 228, that prohibits the mining, extraction, and removal of minerals from the seabed in all state marine waters, with certain exemptions. How is that act impacted or impacting what is currently happening on deep sea mining? Uncle Saul, I don't know if you want to take this.
Yes, thank you very much. And that's a very good question because I was present when the governor signed that bill into law, and I was very, very happy that the state of Hawaii took a position against deep sea mining. The challenge with that is that it is a good thing for the international community to know where Hawaii sits in the issue of deep sea mining, except that the jurisdiction that the state of Hawaii has is only within its waters, and that's up to 3 miles, I believe, from shore, 3 miles outward. The area of deep sea mining is being proposed beyond the 200 nautical miles of nations. So it puts it into the area of the Clarion Clipperton, which is outside of the U.S. jurisdiction. So I have brought that fact into the council at the ISA that Hawaii has indeed signed a law to let nation states know the position of the people of Hawaii. But the reality is that this decision is being made at an international body of which the Hawaii does not participate. But having said that, I just want to briefly put before you is that while I was at the ISA and using the Kumulipo as the foundation for our connection to the deep sea, it was a good segue for me because the Kumulipo that I am using as part of our foundation and connection to the deep sea is the version that was translated by our last reigning queen, Liliuokalani. And at the time that she was overthrown in 1893 and locked up in her bedroom in Iolani Palace, one of the things that our queen chose to do was to translate the Kumulipo from Hawaiian into English. And she says that she hopes that by doing so, it would be more accessible in the future. And she says that she would invite scientists to look at the science within the Kumulipo itself. She invites genealogists to study the Kumulipo, and she says that she has a vision that the Kumulipo will have purpose sometime in the future. It has been 132 years since this illegal action and fraudulent action to overthrow and occupy the Hawaiian Islands by the United States. And I bring that to the floor because had the Queen not taken the time to do this, we would not have this document, our genealogy, to bring before an international body and then tell them why we have a connection to the deep sea. So with the United States seated on the floor, they're not a participant in the decision makings at the ISA because they did not sign or ratify the Treaty of the High Seas. That's why it puts Hawaii in a quandary because the United States sits there as an observer at the ISA and they do not vote and they're not representing the interests of the Hawaiian people. And therefore, it is vitally important that we are there. But also important is to bring the historic relationship of the United States and its illegal and fraudulent occupation of Hawaii to the international body, and then now continue with our efforts using the foundation of the Kumulipo that our queen spent the time while imprisoned at the overthrow to translate 132 years ago. So,
Mahalo, Uncle Saul. And related to this, I brought up that there would be a need for a processing plant for these mined mineral substrates if they were to even be mined in the first place. A similar form of legislation that is being proposed in these coastal states would be to ban these facilities within those states. So while deep sea mining bans within each state only goes out to 3 nautical miles, therefore rendering it more of a symbolic statement than anything. If a state prohibits itself from processing these minerals, that is one way to help guarantee that this doesn't become a viable industry. The next question is that Impossible Metals spends a ton of time trying to distinguish its mining methods from those of other companies. Is there any reputable research on the impacts of Impossible Metals' proposed methods of nodule mining? I can answer this a little bit, but I believe Andrew would be a great person to take this.
Sure, be happy to answer that. So most of the polymetallic nodule mining companies have these tracked crawler systems that involve sucking the nodules into a vehicle that is then pumped to the surface using a riser and lift system. Impossible has a different proposal. They're using these autonomous AUVs, so underwater robots that are kind of hovering across the seabed and using mechanical arms to pluck the nodules from the seabed. On paper, it does look like the technology itself might legitimately have less of an impact than a 12-ton robot crawling across the seafloor. Impossible Metals is very early in the development stage of their technology. They do not have any equipment that has been tested at scale. Their proposed operation is tremendously logistically complicated, and there are a lot of externalities that are discovered in the process of prototyping and developing new technologies. So at the moment, and this is not a criticism of them because they're still early on in the development, we don't really know what the specific impacts of their tools at scale will be. That is the kind of thing that we will learn as and if they get to do environmental impact studies. But on paper, in a one-to-one comparison, they probably do have legitimately a less impactful form of deep sea mining than the most aggressive forms of mining. And I think, the existence of the fact that Impossible is already trying to actively develop tools that are less harmful to the seafloor is an acknowledgement of this deep deficit problem in itself. The mining companies haven't even gotten started, and we already have mining companies saying, wait, hold on. The technology that is already being standardized is probably too destructive. We need to be stepping back already.
Thank you, Andrew. And I think Arlo wanted to add on.
I just wanted to add on one thing. I agree with everything Andrew said. I just wanted to point out that in the eventuality that that their finished product is more sustainable, it's still removing the ecosystem. When you're in these nodule fields, the nodules represent the hard structure that organisms attach to, and in some cases lay their eggs to. It provides the habitat of that community. So even if you are able to get rid of a number of other types of impacts that the other technologies have, you're still removing the ecosystem from the.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
Thank you, Arlo. I just wanted to add on real quickly to what Arlo said, is that he is referring to at least one known such relationship. There's a sponge that only grows on the nodules, and there's a deep sea octopus called the Casper octopus that only lays its eggs on this sponge that grows on the nodules. So even if you had a perfect system that only removed the nodules and didn't disturb the seabed, you're still having a major impact on these two species. And the research around it has shown that about 50% of life in the deep sea in these nodule fields rely on the nodules themselves for some part of their life cycle. Uncle Saul wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, I just want to add to the two presenters and support everything that they are saying. We met with Impossible Metals while we were in Jamaica, and I want people to know that while the preparation of the proposal and the presentations seem to be very, very wonderful in comparison to the metals company's process, it's still in a conceptual stage. It's not developed. It's just an idea that they're going to create machinery that are going to hand pluck nodules rather than just scooping them up, you know. And so they're in competition with the metals company and trying to get support for a technology that's not really operational and developed at this time. And so the point that I want to also make it is still a destructive process in the place of our creation. And that is why, as the indigenous and native Hawaiians, we cannot support either one of those processes because of the fact that they are intruding in the place of creation. So
Thank you, Uncle Saul. Here is a great question. What can a retired geoscientist like me and anybody else do to resist and fight against these deep sea mining efforts? Something other than just donating money. Is there something concrete that people can do?
I'll say one thing that every U.S. citizen can do is call your representatives and congressmen. Representative Ed Case of Hawaii has introduced legislation this legislative session that calling for a ban on deep sea mining in U.S. waters. It doesn't have much support with the way that Congress is currently, you know, well, you guys know what I mean, but that depends on us to change that dynamic. If enough people call their representatives and demands of support for specific legislation or legislation like that, and as well as there is pro-deep sea mining legislation that is seeking to codify Trump's executive order into permanent law, that be opposed. And so every single person, you don't have to donate money to an environmental organization to call your senator yourself.
And I would just add to that as well. All these proposals go up for public comment on the Federal Register. The CNMI one, the Marianas Islands proposal to look at potential mining resources in the waters around the Marianas Islands just went up on the Federal Register today. If you're a U.S. citizen, you have the right to comment on those, and you should comment on those. If you're a retired geoscientist, you have specific expertise that you can use to inform your comments. And so keeping an eye out for when those proposals hit the Federal Register, because the relevant agencies, BOEM or NOAA, are required to respond or to address every comment that's issued in the Federal Register. So make sure that your expertise is being heard when these regulations are being developed as well.
Thank you so much, Arlo and Andrew. Very, very helpful. Let's see. For Uncle Saul, apologies if answered, but what considerations have there been on how Hawaiian Kingdom's restoration can be vital to the protection of the moana? For example, can the Hawaiian Kingdom sign on to these treaties or influence treaty outcomes to protect our moana? Moana is ocean.
The answer to that is yes. So it has been determined by the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague in a very recent decision that the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists in their view after reviewing the chronological history that began in the period prior to the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893. It should be noted that the Hawaiian Kingdom was established as the first nation state within the Pacific since 1843. The issue before these bodies is that information is needing to be updated so that nation states have an accurate understanding of the correct history of Hawaii. And as such, then they should be acknowledging that the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists today. And therefore, their perception or their understanding or the things that they thought were correct is by assuming that the Hawaiian Islands and the Hawaiian Kingdom belongs to the United States is in error. Okay, so having said that, we're not at a point in the ISA to debate those issues, but we are at the ISA to be sure that our connection to the resources of the deep sea are given consideration, that are based on our cultural connection to our place, which is our genealogy, which is tied to the kingdom of Hawaii, because it is what has been our genealogy for the people that has been acknowledged by the heads of our state, from King Kalakaua to Queen Liliuokalani. And we need to maintain that integrity of our cultural connection while we are trying to work out the details of making correction to an fraudulent and illegal overthrow by the United States. And they're complex, but they cannot be just mixed in the conversation, because the issues of the resource right now is what I think is at stake in the ISA, and that's what is now elevated. But making sure that the ISA understands that the United States illegal occupation does mean that the Kingdom of Hawaii is still intact, and therefore your question is, can the Kingdom of Hawaii actually help to uh, ratify that treaty? And I say the answer is yes, it can. And if it does so, then what it does mean that there has to be a process now for the international body, the United Nations, to make accommodations in this authority, the ISA, for the representation of the Hawaiian Kingdom on the floor of the ISA. But as I said, these are different issues at play, but they're coming at the same time that is important, and they must be given consideration in the current discussion. So I hope that helps. But yeah, mahalo.
Mahalo, Uncle Sal. Um, One person asks, I've heard that nodules affect many critical things which affect ocean species, more than just minerals. What are these things? For example, are they magnetic? Do they emit any energy? Andrew, perhaps you can take this.
Sure. So polymetallic nodules are really strange rocks. The way they form is that when something hard sinks to the seafloor, and it's often something tiny like a diatom test, but it can be something large like a shark's tooth, and in some cases even an entire whale bone. As it sits on the seafloor in the deep ocean, because this process only happens under enormous pressure, minerals in the seawater begin to accrete around this hard object, and it slowly, over 5 to 10 million years, builds up these little cobblestones. And when the deep sea mining companies have their big presentations, they usually hold up a gigantic one to show how big and impressive these objects are. But most of them are tiny. They're little tiny. They're like golf ball sized, ping pong sized, little accretions on the seafloor. And the funny thing is, we don't really know exactly how that formation process happens. So they're already a geologic mystery. We have lots of ideas, but the prevailing theory is that there is a biologically mediated process which causes these minerals to accrete on the nodule. And then what's curious is that the nodules don't get buried. So they're sitting on the seafloor for 10 million years. You've got sediment raining down. The sediment takes a long time to build up on the seafloor. Even 10 million years is not that long. in geologic time. But you don't find nodules in the sediment. You only find them on the surface. And the reason for that is that it's likely that where the nodule is contacting the sediment, microbes are slowly breaking the nodules down. And those minerals that break down are then reaccreting back on the surface. So there is this kind of biogenic process, possibly, that is helping to maintain these nodule structures. So there is a curious biologic process that is part of the nodule itself. In terms of whether or not they're magnetic, there's a little bit of iron in them, but they don't have like a huge magnetic field or anything. They are very lightly radioactive in the way that a banana is radioactive. I wouldn't eat a polymetallic nodule, also because it's full of arsenic too, so you don't really want to eat that. But if you were like a person working on a mining vessel that's processing tens of thousands of tons of these nodules, that radiation may be an issue, and that may end up being a health and safety issue down the road for the people working on the nodules, probably more so than the people studying them. Arlo wants me to touch on dark oxygen. Dark oxygen is a relatively new discovery. It was actually discovered by a lab that was funded by Impossible Metals, where they are detecting the production of low levels of oxygen in the nodule field. It is a very preliminary, very tentative study. It is a very tantalizing study because if they do figure out what the actual process is happening there, it would be a totally new way that we produce oxygen on the sea floor that would also have pretty significant ramifications for carbon sequestration in the deep ocean. But it is a very new discovery. There's a lot of research that still needs to be done to figure out what the actual mechanism is to support dark oxygen. The mining companies are saying it's not real. It hasn't really been detected. I think from the preliminary studies that have come out, they've definitely detected something, and it is now in the process where we have to figure out what the actual physical, chemical, or biologic process is that is producing this dark oxygen.
Mhm.
Uncle Saul.
Yeah, I thank you, Andrew. I do want to add a comment to that. When I was in Jamaica, the review and the report on dark oxygen was revealed, and so what I was asked immediately was what my thoughts were about dark oxygen, and this is my response: is that we've already talked about it. When we talked about the fact that Kumulipo and Po'ele as an energy in the deep, deep sea come together, that energy incites the creation of life, and therefore the Kumulipo says the first coral polyp is birth. I say that this is the process that you are describing in Western scientific terms. I said, so one of the scientists who reviewed Andrew Sweetman's findings of dark oxygen made a comment and says, perhaps life is created there. And I said, absolutely. Our case, we rest our case. The Kumulipo has already talked about it. So that energy that I'm talking about is perhaps the energy that, Andrew, you're describing that these polymetallic nodules have. And in that process of this energy, Andrew Sweetman is at this point in time saying that it has enough energy to convert water molecules perhaps into oxygen and hydrogen. And oxygen is needed for creation of life. And in the deep, darkest part of the sea, there is no sunlight that can come to give that kind of energy. And perhaps then that this is a process that we are all coming to understand. But I would like to say that I believe that this is also what is being described in the Kumulipo.
Thank you so much, all three of you. So we have time probably for one more question. We need to wrap up on the quarter hour. Given that fisheries may be impacted by deep sea mining, what does the panel think is the utility of engaging that industry in opposition to deep sea mining? While someone decides if they want to comment, this question is based on the fact that all of our global and oceanic cycles are interlinked. So deep sea mining would be affecting nutrient cycles, food webs, carbon cycles, etc. So that is the basis for this question.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'll just take a real quick stab and a comment to this, is that in our perspective, this idea of the creation of the kumulipo that now helps us to know as a people, we are related to all things created. And so we see our responsibility as an inherent one that means that we need to be able to care for all ecosystems that are created in our genealogy. And in this question, which is asking about fisheries, it is clear to us that the phytoplankton and the zooplankton that are coming from the deepest part of the ocean are really the beginning steps of a food web, and that these are the ones that will create the larger fish that feed the larger fish that feed us. And so for us, it is understanding that we have a responsibility to reciprocate with nature, and our responsibility is to care for that process to continue, because by doing so and reciprocating with nature, it now ensures that we will have and we will become beneficiaries of nature to be able to sustain ourselves as humankind. So our philosophy has always been that we are not separate and apart from nature, but we are nature. And therefore, we have that concept and worldview as the indigenous people to bring forth that kind of experience, that kind of knowledge, and that kind of observation so that we can put things back into its proper balance. And that ensures that we will also become the beneficiaries of that balance. Okay.
Do I have time to add a little bit? I'm going to address commercial fisheries, and I think they're an extremely important sector to be engaged in this. They are probably, other than Pacific peoples, the most significant stakeholder that could be impacted by deep sea mining. There's been a number of scientific, not studies, but sort of more reviews about the potential impacts of deep sea mining, commercial fishing. And there's a significant range of things, from sound disruption to the sediment plumes, specifically the midwater sediment plumes that come from these pumps and risers that Andrew described, that could get in the gill slits of highly migratory species such as tuna. There's also the release of arsenic and all this other bad stuff that Andrew doesn't want to eat, that will be absorbed into food chains, that even if they're not getting into the tuna directly, they're getting into the food that the tuna eats. And these heavy metals are bioaccumulating, meaning it's not like something bad that you ate that you flush out, like your body retains it. And so this stays in the body of the tuna and continues to accumulate over time. So if deep sea mining is an ongoing industry and these contaminants are continuously there, the tuna are going to continue to absorb these into their meat. And because tuna are a migratory species that circle the entire Pacific, you're looking at fisheries in every area of the Pacific potentially being contaminated by this industry. Another recent study has shown that due to climate change, there's a potential that tuna schools may move more into the same areas of interest to deep sea mining, so that there in the future there may be more tuna themselves and tuna fishing overlapping in the areas where deep sea mining is. That said, I think how the fishing industry gets involved is a different question. A group like Greenpeace, that is fighting for marine protected areas or labor rights or bycatch, we're not necessarily the best messenger. But I encourage others, and if there's people on this call you're just consumers of tuna, like that's enough. Contact Starkist, and you're worried about the future of safe canned tuna. They should definitely be involved in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Arlo. All right. Well, I just want to thank everyone for your excellent questions today and for joining us today. If you're in the position to do so, we also encourage you to support the Sierra Club and Greenpeace as we continue to work to protect our oceans and planet. You can do so at sierraclub.org and greenpeace.org. Thank you again to our speakers and to all of you. Have a wonderful week. Thank you.